Hey everybody, it's good to have you once again tuning into our YouTube channel and keeping on track with our Bible Fellowship series here at Chahowee Hills Baptist Church. And thank you for tuning in this week. We're continuing a series. Today I've just decided to do it from my office, and I'm just going to hold my notes in my hand, and we'll go through it this way rather than putting stuff on the board. Because we just want to talk today again in this idea about emotions. There's some important things we're talking about. Last week we talked about the emotion of grief and how grieving was very natural, a part of the human process. We also talked about ways that God has provided us some mechanisms, some tools to be equipped and to walk through those things, not to avoid it, but to survive through it. And we're going to see that consistent theme, I believe, throughout this series over the next still 5 weeks to come. And we're talking today about the emotion of fear. And just like grief, we could say that fear is very real. Almost all of us, practically every one of us, understands what fear is about. Now, we may not have a phobia, which is a word we get from the Greek language. It really does mean a fear like arachnophobia, a fear of spiders, those sorts of things. But we're talking about those genuine fearful times when we're scared, times when we feel like we're under attack, times where we feel maybe abandoned or helpless, that we can't sustain ourselves on our own. And of course, we're talking about this mainly from a spiritual perspective. And let's set the stage here before we move any further. When we're talking about fear, we're not talking about the protection of God and God walking us through this particular emotion with this idea that nothing's ever going to happen to us. No, we understand that in this fallen world, things are going to happen to us, and there are things that are going to come up against us that will cause us anxiety. But we need to understand, just like the idea of walking with grief, we understand that walking with fear is better dealt with and handled when God walks with us. And so we really understand that the fear comes in a lot of different ways. In fact, fear can be healthy. I am afraid of falling off a building, so I'm not going to walk along the very edge and do something silly. So those types of fears can actually help us and work to our advantage. But there's a lot of irrational fears. There's a lot of again, spiritual fears that come about when we don't understand what's going on, and a lot of that comes when we just don't understand who God is or how He wants to walk with us and protect us. And so we're looking in this lesson at Psalm 91. So if you want to turn to the 91st Psalm, you can study along with us. So a couple things we need to point out. The first 6 verses of this particular psalm say the following words: "The one who lives under the protection of the Most High dwells in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say concerning the Lord, who is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. He himself will rescue you from the bird trap, from the destructive plague. He will cover you with his feathers. You will take refuge under his wings. His faithfulness will be a protective shield. You will not fear the terror of the night, the arrow that flies by day, the plague that stalks in the darkness, or the pestilence that ravages at noon." Again, very poetic, literary device here, this idea of the psalm kind of painting this picture that talks about a person living in a fearful state when he sees or senses all of this stuff coming against him. Now, we don't know necessarily who wrote this psalm. We don't know what this person was facing as far as threats, but we can probably categorize this both as the threats that just come against us in life, as well as the spiritual threats, the things that come against us that are unseen. And so we talk about seen threats and unseen threats, but either one of those categories, we still are drawing this picture of the God that watches over us. And this is what we need to really understand when it comes to fear. Is it wrong to fear? Well, no, it's not wrong to fear. It's, again, very natural to be afraid or to feel a sense of trepidation, but it is the job of the believer to cast that fear upon the Lord, to give him those doubts, to give him those worries, and understanding because of who he is and because of how he loves and watches over us, that we can get through fearful situations. And so there's a few things that he does here, this unknown psalmist. He talks about God in 3 different ways. He gives 3 different names that are in the Hebrew, and the first one he says is the Most High. That's the Hebrew El Elyon, which really is literally the God Most High. It talks about the supreme God, the God who's sovereign over all, the one who's above all, and God is our creator. And that's a great reminder for us as believers, because we're not that. We're certainly not in that role, but God is. And so he is the great, high, almighty El Elyon, the one that we can trust. The second thing he talks about is he refers to God as the Almighty. The Hebrew there is Shaddai. You may be familiar with that, El Shaddai. It's the idea of focusing on the power of God. Again, his strength and his might and the things that he can do on our behalf. It talks about the omnipotence of God, the fact that there is nothing he can't do or can't accomplish. This is the God that we're trusting when we're dealing with fearful situations and times. And then, of course, he refers to him by name. In the Hebrew, he refers to the Lord as Yahweh. This is the name that God said, this is how you'll refer to me. You will call me Yahweh, which we translate as I am. I am that I am. That's the, what else can we say? It's really a practically impossible job to describe God or give him a name other than this. I am. That's what he says to call him. And so when we talk about this psalmist acknowledging the not only the goodness of God, but the greatness of God, his strength and his power and his might and his sovereignty, this is the very nature and characteristic of God that we need to keep in mind. It, just like we talked about with grief last week, this is who God is. He's strong enough to handle all of our fears. He's strong enough to handle anything that might come against us in life. And when we say, well, we know that, I know that's a Sunday school answer. I've known that since childhood. Well, there's a difference between knowing it and really putting it into application. And so sometimes those fears can really get a hold of us. And even though in our brain somewhere we know that God is sovereign, we know that God is all powerful, all knowing, all wise, and can be everywhere at any given time. This is all who he is. That is the God we're supposed to trust upon. And sometimes we don't let that happen. It's not that God becomes weak. It's just that in our own doubt, in our own weakness, we begin to focus on our own fears rather than on who God is, and recognizing that he's strong enough to handle any of the fears that we might have. And so that verse goes on to again talk about the protection. The psalmist draws this picture of God both as a protector. You remember when he said that he will be covered under his wings, under his feathers, and it's this idea of a mother bird watching over. You've got the nest and you've got the mother sitting on the birds and that sort of thing. But you think about this idea of even the storms and the wind and the rain coming, and that mother bird can just put the wing over. And that's a beautiful biblical picture. You see that several times in Scripture, this idea that we would be under his wing. And he draws that picture, but he also draws this picture of God being the mighty warrior. And I really picture, in reading this verse, I picture an eagle, maybe a American bald eagle or something like that. It's a big, majestic, powerful bird that can attack and can kill for food, and it's a fierce animal, and yet would nurture its young and offer protection and comfort during times of fear. And that's kind of the picture that we're getting from God, that he is our mighty warrior fighting for us on our behalf, but also loves us so much that he protects and watches over us. And so it's a great, beautiful picture that we see here in Psalm 91 in these first verses. And so it really just becomes incumbent upon us to monitor the way that we walk with God, because that protection and that him fighting on our behalf, that never changes from him. Who he is consistent. It's us that needs to be more consistent in placing our trust in him when difficult times come upon us. He talks about the attacks that come by, the pestilence and the arrows by day and that sort of thing. It's this idea that we don't know when those fears may come. Those attacks may come against us in the middle of the night or in the middle of the day. Again, things that are seen, things that are unseen. It really doesn't matter. All of the fears that we might have about what goes on around us can all be given to God, because he's bigger than all of those. And so the psalmist goes on in verses 9 through 13, and he says this: because you have made the Lord my refuge, the Most High, your dwelling place, no harm will come to you, no plague will come to your tent. For he will give his angels orders concerning you to protect you in all ways. They will support you with their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. You will tread on the lion and the cobra. You will trample the young lion and the serpent. Again, that poetic and picturesque language that's being used there. And so it's this idea, again, of focusing on the protection that comes to the children of God. Just like the Israelites were when they were slaves in Egypt, they were still under God's protection, even when they may have been fearful about what tomorrow held or what was going to happen to them as a people, as a nation, as a race, and as individuals. And yet, and even when the plagues came to Egypt, the Israelites were protected from that. It's this idea of protection that comes from God. And that's still true for us today. There's the idea of God sending protection, and he talks about this idea of angels here in this particular section, and it's what, however he's choosing to deliver his protection is up to him, because he is sovereign and he is God. But a lot of people take this, particularly this verse 11, for he will give his angels orders concerning you to protect you in all ways. They will sort of pull that a little bit out of context and build a case for guardian angels. You may be familiar with that term. A lot of people just believe that without question, that every human being, or certainly every Christian, has a guardian angel. And this verse may suggest something along those lines, but we don't have enough in this verse to really build a case for the existence of guardian angels. We also don't see it being refuted. The door is open in this particular verse, and maybe a couple of others in the scriptures that talk about angels protecting and watching over us. But we have to stretch it a bit to say that there are guardian angels. But there certainly could be. We just don't know enough. But again, the idea is the protection that comes from heaven. Here's what happens when we think about guardian angels or angels watching over us. We sometimes put so much trust in the angel that we forget it's Christ that provided those angels. We forget that it's God that has given that provision to us. And so even if there were guardian angels for you and I, even if I've got one angel up there watching over me, I can't say that I do or don't, but I know that angels do serve at times in this role of protectors. The bottom line is that all comes from God. That comes from the hand of God. And so let's not put our focus on angels so much that we miss the fact that God is our provider and God is our protector. And so we need to understand that God will rescue us in many different ways and watch over us and protect us in many different ways. And perhaps angels are part of that equation. But again, our focus needs to be on the Lord. And then the final thing we look at in verses 14 through 16 is this: because he has his heart set on me, I will deliver him. There's sort of a switch here in the narrative where it's almost like the psalmist is saying, here's what God is saying in response to his pleas, his prayers. He said, I will protect him because he knows my name. When he calls out to me, I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will rescue him and give him honor. I will satisfy him with a long life and show him my salvation. And so, again, we have those reinforced promises of God about protection, about being watched over, and it's really given to who? The psalmist, but because of a couple of reasons. First of all, the fact that God is saying this because he has his heart set on me. That's what God says. I will give you this protection because you have your heart set on me. So again, there's a little trade-off here. Does this mean God won't protect us if we do bad or wrong? No, that's not what we're saying. But what we're saying is God's given this offer of protection more specifically to those who seek after him and are focused on him. And doesn't that make sense? When we choose to live, for example, in obedience to God, we naturally fall under that umbrella of protection. There's no guarantees. But again, if I choose to walk along the edge of a building and push it to the limit, I might fall off. I'm risking that idea of protection. So I choose to live according to God's standards, 50 feet away from the edge of the building. The chances of me falling off are really pretty slim. It's going to have to take something pretty drastic to get me to fall off the building from that far away. And so just by naturally pursuing what God wants us to do, we have that inherent protection that comes. That's why his rules, his guidance, his teachings, his precepts, they're meant for our protection, for just that reason. And so when we don't have our heart set on God, we, maybe not fair to say we forfeit the right to protection, but we open ourselves up to all sorts of things. And then sometimes we live any way we want and then presume upon God to say, God, I thought you said you were going to protect me. Well, if you're walking along the edge of a building and you fall off, was that God not protecting you? Or was that you being a little foolish? I think we can clearly see the delineation there. The second thing that God says about the psalmist, he said, he knows my name. And so there's a picture there of not just knowing who God is, but actually knowing him in an intimate way. And this really stresses this idea of being in a relationship with God. Again, not to presume upon God, not to know him from a distance and acknowledge that he is who he is, but really to be involved in a close and intimate relationship with him. That's what's implied right here. And so it's this idea that we're not just manipulating God because we go to church and we know his name. We're actually taking advantage of the protections that God affords and the love that he has for his children when we are more closely following him and seeking after him and knowing who he is in an intimate way. So the final thing we really want to stress when we talk about God's provision is because we want to be very careful that we're not looking at the scriptures and taking some sort of Pollyanna approach, because we can set ourselves up for trouble when we do this. So you might say, well, I love the Lord, I know him intimately, I seek to live according to his precepts, I understand who he is, he's God above all, he's all powerful and all strong, and yet I wasn't protecting in all things. So you might say, well, I lost a loved one. You might say, I got sick. You might say, I've lost my job, or 3 years ago I was financially secure and now I'm basically living on food stamps and got one step away from homelessness and poverty. So all of these things might be going. You might be under spiritual persecution and attack. There may be things coming around you again that are bringing about very real fears in your life. So how do we justify that? Where was God? Where was his protection when that takes place in your lives? And we can even go back to the Old Testament story of Job. Where was God when all of that negativity was happening in Job's life? Well, we need to remember a few things, and this really goes back to what we talked about at the beginning of Psalm 91. It deals with the sovereignty of God. We hit on this a little bit last week with the idea of grief, this idea that we can't just look at a snapshot in time and base everything that we believe about God on that one snapshot. We need to keep a big picture here. And so it really comes to a head in verse 16 when God promises this: I will satisfy him with a long life and show him my salvation. And so we really need to understand that, again, this life is a short-term journey. And so we need to keep a big picture in mind. So if we look at a snapshot of Job's life, for example, we see one instance where he was being devastated, where Satan was having his way with him, and it didn't look like God was protecting. But in the big picture, God did afford him that protection. He restored him. He gave him more than he had before, and that's a picture of what God can do in this earthly life, in this journey. But in the even bigger picture than that, what do we always see when the child of God, that child of God who's faithful to the Lord, and even if the worst would happen and you would lose your life, we still have the protection of God. We cannot overlook this idea. We cannot get upset at God because something happens to us in a fallen world. We cannot say, God, where have you been? Maybe we're being taught a lesson, certainly. Maybe God is going to show himself in a mighty way at some point down the road. But even in the worst of circumstances, when we've got just fears piling up against us, we can be confident that God will win in the end. So what happens at the end of our journey? We spend eternity with him. And I know that's a maybe a trite answer sometimes. We talk about that over and over again. Even if life is terrible, but for the Christian, it's going to end with victory. That's no trite saying. That is no simple truth. That's a key foundational element that really speaks to how we conduct ourselves in life. Do we live in fear? Are there fears around us? Those are two different questions. Yes, there's fears around us, but no, we don't need to live in fear. There might be things that come against us. There might be things that shake our faith. There might be things that are unknown and unseen, but God knows all those things. God sees all of those things. God knows exactly where we stand. So we must trust in him as a sovereign God, all-knowing, with the ability to watch over and protect us. He desperately wants to protect us. Now, where in the scripture are you going to find that he says, I'm going to keep you from every evil that's in this world? We're not going to find that. The closest we could have found was in the garden before the fall of man. And even then, God didn't offer any guarantees because Adam and Eve had the free will and choice to obey or not obey, and they chose to sin. And that led to the fall, of course, of all mankind. And so we know that that's just part of this life. but God will watch over us. God knows exactly where we are at any given time. He knows when we're distressed. He knows when we're worried. And so we need to really deal with fear by understanding who God is, that He hasn't forgotten us and He hasn't abandoned us. And even in the worst of cases and worst scenario, we still win. And that's something that we absolutely must hold on to. We cannot live life based on a snapshot at a time. There's something to be said about living in the present, but there's also something to be said about looking at the past and all that God has done, and then looking at the future and all that God has promised. And we frame all of that with this bigger idea of who God is and who God has shown Himself to be, and we can rest in that. We can place our fears in His hand and say, God, I don't understand, and be honest with God. I don't know what's going on. I'm afraid, but give that to God and let Him walk with you in those valleys. There's something to be said for knowing that you're not alone. And sometimes we are at our most fearful when we feel like we're by ourselves. Trying to think of an example, if you go to a haunted house at Halloween, if you walk through the haunted house and you know what it is, it's just a goofy thing you're doing for fun. If you're walking through the haunted house by yourself, you're a little bit more nervous. What do you want to do? You want to grab a hold of somebody. You want to go through that with somebody, preferably a group of people. And you want to walk through that so you have someone to grab onto and someone to shriek and scream to. We don't do well oftentimes going through those things by ourselves. And so we need to understand that that's a great reason why it's important to be part of a church, so that you have people in your church to walk with you through those things. But ultimately, who is it that we want walking with us when we're facing those fears? Well, it's God. And we need to live as though we believe that to be true, because it is true. And so that's a real challenge for us to really make that effort and be conscientious to say, I'm not going to let fear run my life, because there's someone in charge of this whole thing that sees more than I see, that knows more than I know, that is all powerful, that loves me enough to protect me and to fight for me and to watch out for me. And again, even though there's no guarantee that no bad thing is ever going to happen to me, this isn't being irrational in dealing with our fears, but it's being rational and understanding these are real emotions, but God is in control. And so I don't know what fears you're potentially going through, even as we kind of face the Christmas season. Maybe you're fearful of what this is going to look like. It could be as simple as you're coming up to the holiday season and finances are tight, and you don't maybe have enough to do what you want to do for the kids. It could be as simple as that. It could be something far greater. It could be something as a result of COVID. Maybe you've facing some uncertainty. Maybe you've lost a friend or a loved one, or you know somebody that's really struggling. Maybe you're fearful about your own physical health, and you're worried about going out and all of those things. And maybe it's something completely unrelated to all of that, but you can place those fears in God's hand. He's big enough to handle all those things. Again, there's no guarantee He's going to make all that magically disappear, but He will walk through those valleys of fear with you. He is big enough to handle that. And so hope that's an encouragement to you. And just reread Psalm 91. Read through that a couple of times this week, and just let those promises and let those assurances sink into your heart, and really understand it's imperative that we call upon the name of the Lord. It's imperative that we live in His precepts and in obedience to Him. It's imperative that we know Him intimately by name. And so let's work on those things that we can control and let God take care of those fears in this world around us. Well, thank you for tuning in. I hope you're having a really great week. We're looking forward again to seeing you here in person or online this coming Sunday. And we got a lot going on here at the church, as I try to remind you every week. And so if you haven't been here in a while, we're really excited about when you can come back and join with us in person. And a lot of changes. Things may look a little bit different when you get here, and we're excited to share that with you when you arrive. I hope that you're really looking forward to the Christmas season, being as safe as you possibly can. But we are looking forward to Sunday morning, December 20th, having as many people as care to come and gather and worship with us, as we'll have a special Christmas service that day. with extra music and some different surprises and that sort of thing. Just a different worship service. Remember, that'll be at 10 a.m. That's December 20th, not 10:30. So it'll be online as always and in person at 10 a.m. on the 20th. And then join us on Wednesday night, the 23rd. We will have we're looking to make a 1 hour, if we can, just a 1 hour long, sort of a family Christmas service. Again, maybe some more Christmas carols and some singing. We'll be taking communion and just having a great time as we really kind of usher in those final days as we get ready for the Christmas season. And those types of events really do help us understand why Christmas is so important. And so I encourage you to be part of those things, either online or in person. Well, thank you again for tuning in. Hope you have a blessed week, and we look forward to seeing you very soon. God bless.